All right, thanks. And let's make sure I click the right boxes and we'll get going. All right, you should be able to see everything okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, yeah, usually I do this in a classroom environment with a lot of interaction. So, and then I ask questions and work off the comments from the group. So I'll just do my best to keep it so it doesn't sound like a canned lecture.
You're welcome. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You're welcome to pause and let the members interact however you want to do it. It's up to you.
All right, then I'm going to put the chat box up here, and if you have questions as I go, just type them in and I'll react real time. All right, let's get going. All right, first I have to throw a big disclaimer. My wife is taking a writing class, and she was taught that when you start your paper, you're supposed to tell your audience why you're qualified. I've written 2 books. The previous book was 8 years ago. The next book comes out next week. I've been in business a long time. Been doing Agile for about 9 years. Now I'm going to be a little bit heretical today, but I think it all works. So we're going to start off with this rhetorical question. When were the Agile principles created? All right, anybody have an idea? If you have the answer for that, I'll give away a free book. Just put it in the chat. I'll give you about 10 seconds here. And of course, it was a trick question because you can't create principles. You can discover them, but you can't create them. And that's how you know they're principles. And that's kind of the core of today's topic, is that we're going to talk about Agile in a broader sense than probably what you've seen in the past. So I grabbed this out of the dictionary just to show that I'm not making things up, but a principle has 2 primary meanings. The first meaning is, and the one we care about for today, is that it is something that's real and true and immutable, and it's based upon facts. It's something that we use to help us make decisions or understand the way things are in the real world, right? The secondary definition you can look at, I think it's number 3, which is a fundamental doctrine or tenet of a group, all right? So I want to make sure that we don't get confused. I'm going to be using the first definition, not the second. And you'll see how that applies here when we get to the Agile Manifesto in a moment. All right. So when you make decisions, if you want to make good principled decisions, you have to understand facts. Okay. Now everybody knows what a fact is. Those are things that are the way they are. The fact doesn't change well until the fact changes, right? But principles are built upon the facts. They're guidelines to help us make good decisions and know how we should react. They're based upon the fact. They never conflict with the facts they're based on. That's really a key thing here. Now, sometimes principles conflict with each other. Now, I'm going to tell you a quick story to explain this. Right, so there's one principle that says that if you do well in your career, you generate the income your family needs to live, housing, clothes, that kind of stuff. There's another principle that says if you spend too much time in your career, your family falls apart. Okay, now those 2 principles exist together. How do you make right decisions about, do I stay at work or do I go home? Well, you have to look at the circumstances. Now, about 7 years ago, I had a client, really big client, and they had a big review meeting, sprint review meeting. Executives were there. If it went well, my contract would get renewed. My wife called me in the afternoon and she said that if I came home early, she'd like me to help her get dinner ready that day. All right, so the question is, do I stay for the big sprint review meeting with the executives, get my contract renewed, or I go home to help my wife get dinner ready? I stayed, right? I reviewed the principles and decided that we can have a bad dinner that night or a late dinner that night, but we needed that contract to get renewed so that we could eat the next few months. Now, about 8 months later, my son got married in a different state, and we had an important meeting with the customer, and the same principles applied. Do I go to my son's wedding or do I stay behind for the meeting? Well, I went to the wedding, right? My son gets married once. The same principles were in play, but the circumstances were different. And so the decision was different. If you want to make good decisions, you really need to know what principles are in play. In fact, I would say the most valuable thing I've ever done as a coach, when people come to me and ask, what should I do? I just turn the question around to them and say, what are the principles that apply to this circumstance? Once they identify what the principles are, then they're able to make the decision on their own. All right, and I look like a genius, but all I do is ask that question that takes care of it. Now, on top of principles, we often have these things called policies. Policies are guidelines based upon the principles so that we don't have to make those decisions on an ongoing basis. If we know what the rule is, we follow the rule. And the main thing here, though, is if you ever run into a situation where the rule that you're asked to follow clashes with a real principle, you should feel completely free to break that rule, break that guideline, and make sure that you follow the principle, because you can break policies really easily, but if you try to break a principle, you'll just break your head against that principle. All right, they won't break. All right, here's a fact, for example. I want to give you an idea for how these facts and principles work together. All right, this quote is the way things really are. When performance is measured, performance improves. When performance is measured and reported, the rate of improvement accelerates. Now, I'm a big fan of Penn and Teller. I'm sure most of you have heard about them. And Penn Jillette, he lost 105 pounds a few years ago and did it in 4 months. When they asked him what the big difference made was, he said that he bought a scale and blood pressure cuff that was tied to the internet. So every time he measured himself, his friends and his doctor saw the measurements. That was the key thing. And he lost. Now along the way, he did a lot of different diet things, but the active reporting is what kept him on the plan. All right. So the associated principles that helped him lose that weight, where he set the goal. The mission was really simple. The doctors told him if he didn't lose weight, he'd die. That was a pretty clear mission. The objective was to get down to a certain weight. He was accountable to his friends. He showed them the information. He was very transparent about every time he weighed and measured himself. And they did learning along the way what things were working and what things weren't working. All right. So you can see that if you know what the fact is, you can put that in place using the principles to help you get to the result you want. All right. Now here's the Agile Manifesto. Now, I'm sure all of you have seen it. These are the values, right? These aren't principles. I would call them more guidelines or values, right? These are things, but they do have 12 principles listed, and these are the principles that are there. Now, this is when I tell you that this is the second kind of principle. These are kind of like foundational beliefs. These are not like classic principles. And the way you know is when you look at each one, if you ask the question, why this, and you can answer that question, the answers to the why, you keep asking it until you get down to the bottom. Those are the principles. So for example, let's look at number 2, right? Welcoming change requirements even late in development. Why do we want to do that? Because we know that communication and flexibility and planning and putting the outcome first helps us to get to great results, right? Number 11 is the best architectures and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. Well, self-organizing teams isn't really a principle. It's a great operating outcome because of accountability and collaboration. Okay, and just one more example. At regular intervals, teams reflect on how to become more effective. All right. Well, why does that work? Because of accountability and collaboration and validated learning. Okay. If you want to know the principles involved, ask why. I've been at companies where they tell us to do a certain thing. We ask why, we can't find an answer. That's how you know you're at a bad company. All right, let's move on here. So I created this list here of 12 principles. I call them the Agile principles for business. Now, these are not, as my son would ask, are these canon? He likes watching the Marvel movies and wants to know what's canon and not all the time. These are the 12 that I like the most. There are some obvious ones not on here. For example, have respect for others and be kind and put customer-centric stuff. That's not on the list, but it's kind of implied. But this is the list. I want to take your understanding what Agile is. I want to expand it to beyond software development, to all business, to personal life, right? These principles work everywhere, and we're gonna get into that in looking at our case studies and talking about it. All right. I don't think there's anything on here that you don't understand. They're pretty self-explanatory. So let's drive forward. Now I got a video here. I asked here. Let me fire this up. I asked some friends. You've worked at companies that had a chance of doing great things but didn't quite do it. Why didn't they succeed?
A lack of understanding of how things work today and how they needed to.
Was that loud enough for everybody? Thumbs up, Dan? Okay.
A lack of understanding of how things work today and how they needed to work in the future, and then how to actually make that transformation happen. They thought they knew what happened, but they didn't take the time to really understand how things operated.
Knowledge, organization, and communication.
I would say it was their inability to trust one another. So it was multiple teams, and they had a hard time trusting one another, so they could only achieve what each team could achieve instead of achieving what the group could achieve.
The main thing that kept it from doing a whole lot better was just the fact that they couldn't keep the resources focused on the right areas. That, something would pop up and a fire would happen, and the wrong resources would get devoted to that fire instead of maintaining focus and keeping pointed in the right direction.
Being scared to make decisions.
Probably struggled making the hard decisions.
They outsource their core competency.
Why'd they do that?
I have no idea why.
What comes to mind is the middle layer of management not embracing the company's bigger mission.
They didn't feel like they could make the right choice or the right decision without having to go through multiple layers of management for approval.
All right. Now that was a pretty good cross section of workers all the way from middle to the top of some very huge companies. Now I went back to the same group and asked them, showed them a list of those 12 and said, now which of these, if you could pick one, would have solved the problems at that company you mentioned earlier? And this is what we got.
All of them.
Or we can only pick one?
If I had to just pick one.
But I want it all.
Oh, my favorite, accountability. Because I think accountability forces you to focus on what needs to be accomplished and then organize yourself around what needs to be accomplished.
I think accountability, and really in that situation, one, people didn't feel like they were accountable, and so they didn't feel like they owned the decision. They didn't feel like they were empowered to make a decision, and it was almost like they were going into work just to punch the clock. With more accountability and more empowerment, they would have been able to move quicker, more agile in their work product, and ultimately perform better in their responsibilities.
Yeah, I would have probably picked collaboration for that group in that instance.
So probably making choices based on validated learning rather than opinions or conventional wisdom.
Making choices based on validated learning rather than opinions or conventional wisdom.
Making choices based on validated learning rather than opinions or conventional wisdom.
Making choices based on validated learning rather than opinions or conventional wisdom.
I think leadership instead of micromanagement would have been good. There was at my prior company, the company operated under fear of the CFO or CEO, not CFO, and they were afraid of making a mistake and they're afraid of telling him the truth.
Define mission and objectives. I've found that the organizations that I have worked with, though they have goals that they're trying to reach, they don't have the true mission, and we miss because of it.
All right. So based upon what I've talked about, when people ask me what Agile is, I tell them it's a set of principles or a philosophy to help us make right decisions and to evaluate our options and to act appropriately. All right. And that applies in whatever venue we're talking about. And it's opposed to the idea that we can have a perfect plan that we can stick to forever, and that we can get by with having rigid processes and optimization to get to a consistent success. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. So really easily, right? When you have a company, whether it's small or large, I use this analogy when I'm talking to leaders, and I say, in an airplane, who do you want to make the decisions about which direction the airplane should go? Should it be the company president? Should it be somebody back at the company headquarters? Should it be somebody in the control tower? And everybody understands, right? You want the pilot to make the decisions. They're the ones at the controls. They're the ones that see everything. They gather the information from everywhere. They're the ones that should make the decisions. They have the training, et cetera. They have the accountability. Everybody in the company has their roles to make the flight successful, but you want the pilot to do so. And the same goes in a business. You want the people at the controls to make the decisions. Now, without these Agile principles in place, those decisions might not be so good. And the point that I really want to stress here is that if you teach correct principles, then people can manage themselves, right? And that's really the measuring stick I used to make sure that the list of those 12 principles are the right ones. If you have those principles in place, can everybody do their job and make great decisions for success? All right. So this isn't. This is just a theoretical diagram here, right? So the methodologies or frameworks like Scrum or Kanban or the other 30 or so Agile methodologies, those sit on top of the philosophies of Lean and Agile, right? The principles behind it are what make things work, right? They're the things that give you the results, not the methodology. Those are the policies that we have based upon those principles that help us get to where we want to go. But it's the principles that pay off for us. So I'm going to look at two case studies, one business and one from history, to show you that years and years, decades before the word Agile was used in software development or other places, the principles were there and they worked. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just enough. Parachuting was invented by the Russians. It was first demonstrated way back in the 1700s, and the first person I could find that saw a military application was Benjamin Franklin. They developed it. Some Nazi officials saw it when they were visiting Russia, and they're the ones that practiced and worked and made it part of their blitzkrieg in 1939 very successfully. In the Battle of Crete, they had their very first kind of percentage of failure, and it freaked them out and they canceled it. However, the Battle of Crete, they captured the entire island of Crete in just over a week. When the Allies saw that, they decided they needed to learn how to do parachuting and gliders. So the exact same event, the two groups saw very differently. But the point here is that at the start of the war, none of the Allied nations used paratroopers or gliders in their battle That was something completely new to them. They practiced when they're in their work in Africa and in Sicily and Italy. They worked with trying to organize everybody in a collaborative sense. The Americans were fighting along with the British and the Canadians and the Australians, and the French and the Belgians that were there with them. They did things very differently, and they had to learn and experiment and try new things. It was a very difficult transitional period. So while the Allies were learning how to work together, the Germans were building this big defensive system along what they called the Atlantic Wall. And you can see from the diagram, they had it very well defensed. Multiple layers of obstacles and guns and so forth, reinforcements, which made any invasion along that coast very difficult. So the Eisenhower and his executive staff put together this plan for using paratroopers and gliders to invade. Again, it was all new. They had to take special groups troops out of their normal army and train them how to do these things and learn new ways to do it. There are a lot of tragedies along the way, but they learned how to do so and put the planning together. Their idea was to, while the Germans were expecting them to attack in Calais, they decided to go to Normandy. I think everybody knows of this somewhat. Specifically these beaches. And you can see that the paratroopers and the gliders were to land behind the enemy lines here, these two places over here and over here by Cannes, and go behind the lines and prepare the way for those who are coming up on the beach. Now, the 2 or 3 days before the invasion, the air marshal, who had years and years of experience with Air Force, he was British, with air operations, he had been a general for a decade, went to Eisenhower and told him more than half of this force is going to be killed. It's not going to work. And it was General Eisenhower, whose background was, cavalry, made the decision to go anyways. He realized that if they didn't have this air group, they called it Operation Neptune. They didn't have this, the rest of the invasion wouldn't work. Then they had the issue with the weather because there were storms coming through, and they made the decision to go, and they took off. Although because of the accountability that Eisenhower felt, he shook the hand of every paratrooper before they left the night before. All right, so they landed in France. Nothing went as planned because the communications were difficult. What they did was they told everybody what their objectives were, and then they trusted them to make decisions on the ground to get the primary objective if possible, if not their secondary, if not, do whatever they could. Things did not go as well as they had hoped. They went slower than expected, but they were successful. And initially, the idea was that they would land on the beach and they would go directly due east to go towards Paris. The problem was that the defenses the Nazis had were strong there, so they went south. And then they kind of swung around. They called it like a gate hinge. Went from the south back up to the north around to get where they were going. Now, obviously, they were successful. You've taken some history, you know what happened. Why were they successful? The answer is going to be really simple. The Allies were agile, right? They relied on leadership and flexibility. They went to where they could. If they found out they couldn't go that way, they went somewhere else. They used objectives, and they really trusted the people on the ground to make decisions based upon what they saw. There were many, many stories that we could talk about how the people who stepped up and took leadership positions, and that they were enabled by their leaders for whatever they needed to make things work. Now, why is it the Germans lost? Because they weren't. They were very much micromanagers, right? People that were in the area wanted to respond to the invasion, called up Berlin and said, can I send out my tanks? Berlin said no. It was very much command and control, right? It's when I started reading, I did not go into it expecting to find agility, but it was all over the place. All right, second case study is iOmega, and I don't know if this has ever been published before, but here we go. I was there, so I have the inside scoop. The company was set up in 1980. It's a computer hardware company. They made this thing called the Bernoulli box, and it was a 10 megabyte removable storage device that was external. You connected it to your computer through a SCSI port. It's about $2,700, the first one. Way back at that time, I was working in a computer store, and I remember I sold a 10 megabyte external hard drive. I sold it for $1,800. All right, so that's the nice thing about the Bernoulli box is you spent $2,700 and maybe $100 for each cassette, and now you could have 20, 50, 100 megabytes of storage. Well, they did quite well. They IPO'd. Their sales got up to about $150 million, and then kind of vacillated back and forth. They went from 10 to 20 to 44 megabytes to 88 megabytes, 128 megabytes, 230 megabytes in size. The prices came down because of competition, so that they were on this treadmill, they called it, of trying to advance the product, but they never got any benefit in increased profit per unit. That was just so they could keep selling. At the same time, you know, they weren't making any money. They were running as fast as they could, and they weren't making any profits. And so they knew they had to do something different. So they brought in a new CEO. His name was Kim Edwards. And he said, we need some direction. We need to give customers the storage products they want at a price at where they want to buy them and at a price they're willing to pay. And everyone in the company was forced to memorize this. And then act on it. So the first question was well, what storage products do they want? Well, my boss, Tony, and some friends went out to the world and started asking people, what do they want? They found two things. They found a really big consumer market, and those people said they wanted a good product at a great price. And they asked, well, what's a good product? How fast does it need to be? Well, these are the unsophisticated people. They said, I don't know, fast. And they said, well, how big does it need to be? And they say, well, you know, big enough for my stuff. Well, that was the kind of the specs they wanted to get, but that gave them enough to get moving. So then they found another market, and that was kind of the pros out there. And these are people that were doing like desktop publishing and design work, you know, things that had bigger files. And these people said they needed to have a great performing product at a good price, kind of just like the opposite of the consumer. And they knew what they wanted a gigabyte. They wanted to be as fast as a hard drive. They wanted to feel like a normal hard drive. All right, so we were able to size up how big that was, and then they mapped that against what the previous Bernoulli box. The Bernoulli box market looked like that, right in no man's land between the two. That's why it was so difficult to sell more, because, well, the market just wasn't big enough. There was enough for them and one competitor, and that was it. So Kim made the decision, we're going to dump the Bernoulli box, and we're going to move into these other two markets with a new product. One that is a great price and good performance, and one with great performance at a good price. Well, the company didn't have those things. They had to create those products. And he avoided having a mutiny in the engineering group. That it came really close. They were really proud of the work they had done, and they were just told that we're going to throw all this stuff away. Instead of doing things like trying to make the capacities bigger, there was a big push to make the cost smaller. Very different kind of effort. Regardless, this is what happened. They came out with two products, the zip drive and the Jazz drive. If you are younger than I don't know, 45 years old, you probably don't remember these things. This is what happened. The company went from about 150 million in size to 300 million to 1.2 billion to 1.7 billion. All that happened in just under 3 years, right? Huge. Now, I'm showing you what the results are, but I want to really emphasize the agility that was going on because everybody knew what the mission objectives were. It was easy for people to have conversations. Instead of having like a 2-hour meeting, we have like a 15-minute hallway conversation. Instead of having everything fancy and trying to impress each other, there was a time to try and impress each other. We would just go in and get stuff done, right? We would go in and we would collaborate and get things fixed. If there was a problem, we'd resolve it. There wasn't any really pushing around to try and get promotions or look good because everybody's trying to save their job. And everybody felt like it was just one big team. It was quite fantastic. Well, obviously, if you go from 150 million to $1.7 billion in 3 years, you have to hire a bunch of new people. You know, it was difficult bringing people in and maintaining the culture. Well, what happened when we got to 1.7 billion? The mission was changed. It was changed to maximize shareholder value. Well, no one knew what that meant. It was interpreted 100 different ways. Now, when we had an important meeting, there was a meeting to get ready for the meeting, to review the slides. And then we'd have a meeting with 30 people in there, and it was 2 hours long. And then we'd have a meeting after the meeting to discuss what was happened at the meeting. Things slowed down because we were doing so well. You know, the share price, we went from 67 cents. This is changed for splits, from 67 cents to $150 in 2 years. That's how much Wall Street loved the company. At one point, it was the most shorted product on the New York Exchange because people thought the price is so high, it has to come down. It was crazy back then. This is the middle of the .com stuff. The market cap maxed at $7 billion. But that's a 500-time increase. Now, it's not because we were using Scrum, because Scrum, we'd never even heard of that back then. It wasn't because we were doing something called Agile. It's because the company was Agile. They were using those principles. But by 1997, when it got big and the mission changed to maximize shareholder value, now everybody was kind of fat, dumb, and happy, and they didn't feel the urgency to use those principles anymore. It became much more of a traditional company, and this is what happened. The revenues fell. And then eventually the company was sold for $128 million. All right. It went from a trough to a peak to a trough. And all that's because when they were using these principles, they had great performance. When they stopped, it fell apart. They were just trying to maximize whatever, marginal improvements without worrying about anything else. So the point I'm trying to really emphasize here is that there in business, in life, there are only two kinds of things. There are the things that are able to act on their own, and there are the things that are acted upon. Now, I would much rather be the boy in this video than the rock. All right. When iOmega was growing, its competitors were the rock. They had no choice. They had to close their businesses because they got beat. When we were at iOmega, we were growing, it was fun. It was hard work, but we were all having fun because every day there were new opportunities and new things happening, and it was a blast. When things were shrinking, it was horrible. All right. Now, where are we? The reason why Agile is great for business is because it has a big payoffs, but there's a reason why Agile is great for people, because it helps them. Now, there's this big study in London. It went over about a decade. It looked at taxi drivers and bus drivers. Now, these jobs are basically the same. Sit in a vehicle, operate the vehicle. Same town, same time of day. But when they examined the taxi drivers versus the bus drivers, they found that the taxi drivers' brains, specifically their hippocampus, was bigger, like up to 20% larger. And they did some research on this, and they found out that a big reason is because the taxi drivers are making decisions all day. How do I get from here to there? They have to think about the different locations inside of London. And London is the second largest metropolitan area in the world, right? There's a lot to learn. Whereas the bus drivers are taking the same route every day. And there's some more detail to that study, but the point is that putting the decision-making into the people's hands in your company and not just having the command control approach, it's good for the business and it's good for the employees. It's good all the way around. And that's why Agile should be adopted. Okay, now, when I was young, I loved playing in the water. I loved doing great, performing and doing all these fun things. Now that I'm old and broken, I don't have the same opportunities anymore. But I want you to think about it being in a good company. It's like riding a wave, right? Metaphorically, it's a pretty good metaphor. You get to have a whole lot of fun. You get to move with the industry as it moves, taking care of your customers. Now, to do that, there's this little paradox, is that you don't just get to jump in the water and start riding waves immediately. There's a little bit of a transitional piece. Now, this is a photo of Santa Cruz, a particular surf spot called Steamer's Lane. And if you look at it and answer the question, who in this photo is the most comfortable? Well, the answer is the people that are up there behind that rail. They got on their clothes, they're dry, they got a jacket on, it's a cool day. They're comfortable, they're watching what's going on, right? Who's the least comfortable? Well, that's this guy down here in the middle of the photo that's paddling. That water's cold. When you first get in the water there, it'll give you an ice cream headache because your head will actually shrink. It's about 56 degrees Fahrenheit when you jump in there. And that first time you go under a wave and the water goes down the wetsuit, boy, it's a cold wake up. But who's having the most fun in this picture, right? It's the surfer that's on that wave there. He to get to having the fun, he had to go through that transitional point, right? Now, those of you on this call that are involved in Agile work, as a coach, as a Scrum Master, as a leader, that making that transition can be very painful. But my experience is that most leaders and companies, managers, they go through they want to look like they're doing something. They get wet, but they don't jump in all the way. Now, the case studies we went through and your own experience and logic is pretty simple here, that you can't go surfing if you're gonna only get wet up to your ankles. You can't have a 10x kind of improvement unless you're willing to change. All right. The great thing about Eisenhower and the research I did wasn't that he pulled power to himself, was that he pushed the power out to the edges of his organizations. Right. And that was very different for a military leader to do. Right. You have to do things, differently. So let's look at kind of the conclusions I have here, is that whether your company's growing or stagnant or shrinking, it's all about the same amount of work, right? You're doing a whole lot of work, you're going in early, staying late, but if you are having a lot of fun, it's because the company's doing well, all right? The growth is better for society, it's better for your customers. It means you're doing the right things, you're providing the right services, the right products, you're using your resources properly. Every place that I've seen where the company fully embraces Agile principles, they grow 10 times, all within 5 years. I've seen it happen in as short as 1 year. I've seen it happen within 2 years several times, with firsthand. I've seen it happen quite a bit. If they're fully committed, fully embrace the principles, they do well. It means that to fully embrace the principles, they have to let go of a lot of other things. Now, it's not working smarter or harder or whatever else you want to throw in there. It's just being different, right? These principles, when you use them, as the way to make decisions, it forces you to do things differently than what you've done before. All right, and obviously it's uncomfortable at first. The point is that if all you do is just look for the small incremental improvements, let's try to be 1% better, let's embrace half of these things, you're not going to ever get the full benefit. Don't settle, right? Go for it all the way. Now, if you really want to be safe, the best choice is to go all the way, because the only way for your company to stay safe is for it to be continually changing, to have that ongoing sustained growth, right? Too many people, when they feel threatened, they want to crawl into a hole or revert back to the way they were before. You really have to avoid that instinct. So, again, 10x, or you want to call it 1,000% growth or not, either way, it's okay. Personally, the best I've seen, I showed you at iOmega, we grew, our market cap grew 522. Our sales grew about 10.5x. I've been in a company where in 1 year, we improved our outcomes by 16,000% in 1 year. No additional budget except for, me there. So these are the Agile principles for business, the list. And, a long time ago when I started doing speaking and presentations, I learned that I never got complaints for finishing early, and I just finished. So we can move to the questions and answers. If you have a question,
Yep.
Throw it in there.
Yep, I was gonna say, or feel free to unmute and ask your questions that way.
Oh, that's even better. This is your shot to challenge me or to ask a hard one, try and stump me.
Hi, good evening, or I'm not sure what time it is in America, but in the UK it's past midnight, so good evening, early morning. I wanted to ask about the pushback you got regarding applying these agile ways of working.
Yeah, I would say of all of the challenges I've had as an Agile coach, that's the primary one. And I would say the most, the biggest thing that I've heard, the most consistent is, it comes this way. That's really good, but right now we have this problem to deal with. Or, oh, a big thing just popped up and we have to deal with that. So we have to put this aside for the short period of time. Have you heard that?
Yes, definitely. There are some people that are used to basically, if they've been performing well, even if it isn't in an agile way, they think, oh, don't really, just leave us as we are.
Yeah, one time I was at a client and one of the managers of the group said, well, I don't need to do this because from last year to this year, I'm 50% better. So I'm already improving. I don't need any help. Well, 50% improvement isn't 10 times improvement. And so let me give you one from a case study that we talked about, and then one from my personal experience, and hopefully this will help you. When the decisions were being made for D-Day, all the generals were pushing back to Eisenhower and saying, oh, let's not do it that way. I'm uncomfortable with this, or we can't do it this way. We can't use the The paratroopers, that's still too new. It's still too different. They're not gonna work because we can't talk to them. Back then, they didn't have radios that could communicate from England to France. The radios they had two kinds of radios. One were called handy walkies, or handy talkies. That's right. And they only worked about for 5 miles difference. And then they had another one that they carried on their back that worked for about 10 to 30 miles. And they weren't very reliable. And so they had to rely on the people on the ground to make all their decisions, and if they dropped them in by a parachute. Well, Eisenhower sat back and he said, well, if this invasion isn't successful, the war is going to get lost. So I need to make this invasion successful. And if I don't have the help of the paratroopers to go in behind the lines to prepare things, the invasion isn't going to work. And so he said, no matter how much I am afraid to do it, I have to do it if I want success. And that's one of the approaches you have to work with your leaders, is that no matter how much you don't like it or how difficult it is, if you really want to have success, then this is the way to do it. And so just kind of, shut up and do it. Now I'll give you an example from myself. I had a client, I was working with the product management group, and I was doing the training, and the vice president of marketing was in the room. And we were talking about time boxes and how when we enter in a sprint, the sprints have to be sacred. We can't break the time box. You can't shove stories into a sprint. They can only be pulled in when the other work is done. And well, the vice president, he heard that, and that got his attention, and he said, well, wait a minute, I have a customer. It's the biggest customer we have. It's like a global Fortune 5 company. I would tell you, but I think he still wants me to keep that confidential. And they were like 40% of the revenue of this firm. Well, he said, when that customer has a problem, I need my people to drop everything and make them happy. So this whole sprint thing is going to work for us. So I asked him a few questions. I asked, well, why do these problems happen? Why do you have to react the way they are? And he said, well, our product has a few problems with it. And so if those problems come up, then we have to react to fix them and put a patch over it to make it work. And I said, well, why haven't you designed your product or improved it so it wouldn't have these problems? He goes, well, we're very busy, so we haven't been able to. So I asked him this question: what if you let your team work on their priorities to improve the product, and if you didn't bother them, maybe they could finish it so you wouldn't have to react. Your customer would just be happy because the product would work without having to intervene. And he sat there for a full minute, and he turned to me and he said, you're right. If I ever ask you to do anything in the middle of your sprint, tell me no. And that was the big change that helped them go from, an agile group that was having problems to an agile group that could perform. You have to get management's buy-in to jump in all the way. Does it help?
Thank you. That was very insightful.
Now I'll give you one more analogy. I tell you, I love analogies. This is my last one. So, have you ever gone to a pool in the UK? Right, the water's good, but the air is cold, right? If you jump all the way in the water and swim, it feels nice and warm, and you feel pretty good. But if you were to sit on the edge of the pool with your legs dangling into the water, you're going to be freezing. And if you get out of the water, move away from the water and go back and sit far away and put your coat on, you're going to be nice and warm, right? Agile companies that are trying to agility that don't fully embrace the principles are like people who sit at the edge of the pool with their feet dangling in the water. They're going to be uncomfortable. They're going to hate it. They're going to say the water's too cold, the air is too cold, I don't like it, we're not getting results. You either have to tell them quit and go back to the chair and put a coat on, or jump all the way in and swim, right? Halfway is going to be miserable. And if they say, I don't like this, I'm miserable, then your answer's got to be, because you're going halfway. Go all the way in or get all the way out.
Thank you. That was a brilliant analogy. I'll be sure to use it in the future.
And every time you go near the ocean or to a pool, you remember it, right?
Yes, it's easy to remember as well. And I'm sure they can relate. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else?
Hello, James. My name's Graham. I'm in Colorado. Good evening.
Hi, Graham.
The team I worked on, we started using Agile at the start of the year, so we're quite new to it. But the biggest problem that we had was we could work fine within our team, but when we had to interface with another team, our priorities never seemed to match their priorities. And we were having to design our stories such that we could have a break while another group did something for us or sometimes didn't do something for us. And we never really resolved that.
Well, the answer is really quite simple.
Yeah.
And it's so simple, you're going to hate yourself you didn't think of it. I'll explain it and then you'll get it.
Oh, well, simple answers, simple questions. Good.
All right, well, here's the situation. You're missing one of the key principles. You're missing the defined mission and objective. You need to go one level up. You need to get that leader to say, what is it that you want us to do? You need to have that you need to force the leadership to set those objectives, and those need to be consistent for everybody at your level, right? So that the teams that are adjacent to you know what your objectives are, and they have their own objectives, and now you know how to collaborate with each other.
So really, it was well, maybe it was it is a management problem then.
Yeah, in fact, if you ever read Deming, you'll find out that 93% of quality problems are management's fault. Now he calculated that based upon manufacturing on a factory, but again, I've been in marketing and senior leadership in companies, and I'll tell you that that's the case, right? You're fighting a battle that you cannot solve on your own. You have to go at least one level higher and have leadership solve it for you.
Got it. I work in technology. If that helps, I know Agile is supposed to be applicable in nearly every case, including
technology is one of those cases.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Thank you. I will bear that in mind going forward. Thank you, James.
Yeah. So again, what you're doing, you expressed the same thing that we were talking about earlier. You were trying to be successful with Agile without all the principles being involved, without leadership and without a defined objective. The rest of them don't work enough on their own. You need to give all of it.
Got you. Principles and objective.
Right.
Thank you.
Just really clear, right? What is it you want us to do? What do you want them to do? Now everybody knows how to work together.
Yeah. Thank you. I will go and review those principles again. Thank you very much.
Sure. All right. What's next?
Yes. My name is Olushola. I'm in Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
My question is basically on, I guess, the last person who spoke about dependencies around other teams to, align for the general outcome as regards to product. The thing is, it's not always, how do I say it? You try to clarify that we should always learn to collaborate well, to align our mission and objectives, to give a clarity to it. But sometimes we do that, and at the same time, we have maybe there's a spike in terms of maybe trying to deliver what we need to do to use to finish our own sprint.
Mm-hmm.
In such situations, definitely we'll have spillover to move to the next sprint. In such situations, how do we kind of create a kind of clarity from the start? If there is a spike, there should be a way other teams should communicate to us, or how do we go about that?
Okay. Well, I'm a bit of a heretic because I think spikes are just another piece of prioritized work. All right. For example, I have a personal life. We all do. And when I have clients that are or customers I need to go travel to in my car, travel time is part of my job. And if I don't go put gas in my car, then I don't show up at my customer, right? And so putting gas in my car doesn't sound very important. It's kind of trivial. It has nothing to do with my job. But if I don't do it, I can't do my job. Now, if we were to look at our standard way of looking at our backlog, we would take, there are some stories that are important because of our work and some spikes, like buying gas for my car. But if I didn't buy gas for my car, I couldn't do anything else. And so I would challenge you to say that don't look at your spikes as something that are separate from your other work. This is prioritized work you need to do. Right?
Yeah.
And so if you don't, so when you look at when you set up your sprint planning meeting, you have your prioritized work to do. That includes your primary work and your support work. And you pick the things that are most important, you pull them into your sprint, look at your velocity to make sure that everything you commit to at that meeting is something that you can finish. And that way you have a really good chance of picking the right thing. If you have one of these stories that could be small or huge, then I would recommend putting a time box on it to say, we're going to work on this thing for a total of 12 hours or a total of 7 hours or 6 hours during the sprint. And that way you can size it and you can make sure that you finish everything during the sprint.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
All right. But don't fall into the trap of saying there's my normal work and my spike. If it's important, you have to do it. And if it's not important, you shouldn't do it.
Okay. All right.
There are a lot of, let me give you another example.
Okay.
Once a year in the United States, we have open enrollment for healthcare benefits, right?
Yes.
Signing up for that should be a story because it takes time. And if you don't define it, people are going to take the time to do it anyways, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So put it in a story, size it up, make sure that people have the time to do it and not break your sprint. All right. Is there a big holiday in the UK during your sprint? Well, you better plan for it because you're not going to have time to do anything else that day.
Okay. No,
everything should be sized, everything should be estimated, everything should be accounted for, so that when you make the commitment at the start of a sprint planning meeting, you can still hold everybody accountable for finishing everything at the end.
Yeah. So you also raised something. Sorry about that. About estimation. I think that's one of the reasons why, because some other teams that we work with, for example, we use the Fibonacci sequence. We already know the logic behind it. But the other teams, some of them use days, which is not wrong. Do you understand? I guess that is where I think we are still growing into a formidable agile community, which we should have an aligned mission and objective. I think maybe
if you don't know what your mission objectives are, then you have a hard time prioritizing your backlog.
Yes, I guess that's
again. For example, if you have an objective that says that you want your employees to be happy, then you're going to be prioritizing things like signing up for your benefits, or having a team party occasionally, or having some career development training that gets prioritized and put into a backlog, right?
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
All right. And then the last thing is, again, anything that you don't have finished at the end of a sprint, you put it back into the backlog, you re-estimate it, you reprioritize it, you go into the next meeting, you do the same thing, you pull it in, you make a commitment to finish it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I appreciate you there.
Just think about anything that's not trivial, anything that you can't do in 2 or 3 minutes, should be a story.
Okay.
I mean, you don't have a story about looking at your email. That can happen, in the background a little at a time. But anything that is more than that should be a story.
Okay.
And I will tell you this: when I got into Agile, I thought the Fibonacci approach for doing estimating was stupid. It didn't make any sense to me, but within a year, I became its biggest fan. It works.
Those are actually, I love, being relative with stories and the sizing and all those things. It actually shows, because I actually coached my team on it, because what I used was, okay, what effort are you going to use to bite an apple, and what effort are you going to use to bite a berry? Do you understand? I use that to explain to them. That's why we actually, do that sizing and do the estimation using the Fibonacci sequence. So it kind of gave it clarity to why I actually brought that.
Well, I've used it in my personal life. Over the last 7 years, I have a Kanban for my personal life. It has things like wash the car, mow the lawn, take my son to his activity at school, all those kinds of things. And I will tell you that if I'm not sick, I can do 340 points a week, and it's pretty consistent in the way that I'm using points. And this is about things that are very, very different. Things like personal study to going to a party, and it works.
It does, yeah. It does. Thank you.
Now, again, what are the principles behind it? That's what we're talking about here. The principle is we need, because of accountability, we need to be able to know what we can commit to and what we can't. So we need to estimate it. But the other principle is that we don't want to spend too much time, right? Because we have to do other things. And so the Fibonacci approach allows us to have a good enough estimating system that doesn't take too much time to do.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'll try revise the principles again, to achieve business agility. And
the other thing I would advise when it comes to estimating is I've seen a lot of people who say that they only don't want any stories to be higher than 5 points. There's a reason why you get to go from 1 to 21. Some things are a whole lot bigger than others. Use the whole range if you need to. Don't feel like you're constrained to use less than that.
Okay. That's another part of it. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Who's next? Linda, did we get anybody write in to what their favorite principles were?
Let me go double check. I didn't see any earlier, but let me go check.
Well, while you're looking, I'm going to tell you my favorite principle. My favorite principle is accountability, because it makes all the others work. If you don't have a leader that's accountable, then maybe she's not going to get around to doing the mission and objectives. She's not going to care if you're not communicating, right? If people are accountable, then they care, they do it. What's the most important meeting in a sprint schedule? It's the sprint review meeting, because your leaders come and you hold each other accountable. If you don't have the sprint review meeting, then people aren't going to pay attention as much to what happens during the sprint. Accountability activates everything else. And when I talk about accountability, I'm not talking about the ability to blame. I'm talking about the responsibility for the things under your stewardship and being able to actually do it, right? Accountability is not just blaming people when they don't succeed or praising them when they do. It's giving them what they need to be successful. That's the number. I will tell you this, before I heard about anything about Agile, when people ask me what a manager's job did, I would always say the manager's number one job is to make his people successful, because if he doesn't do that, then nothing else matters, right? And that is the foundational piece of accountability, helping people to be successful in whatever position they have.